Hello, successful and soon-to-be successful traders. Chris Capri here, secondsguysforex.com. Welcome to another video in the trading mindset section of the advanced price action course. This one is on 4 psychological biases which will kill your trading performance. So the reason why we're covering this one is because it's very common for us to take very predictable routes of action or reactions or responses to various things that we experience while trading. And if we aren't aware of them, then there's nothing we can do about them. So, really the first step is just becoming aware of the existence of these things. And then the next step is starting to become aware of us experiencing these things in real time. Lamentably, usually our awareness of those things doesn't happen initially. Like we learn about something and then we see it happening in real time. It generally doesn't work like that. Usually we learn about something and then we don't see it as something that has happened for us until after the fact. And that's partially because of our awareness and focus and clarity is not totally in the moment. It's not totally present. And so if we're not present, then we're not going to be able to detect these things. So with that being said, I'm giving this lesson because, there are many different psychological and cognitive biases that we have that are defaults to our brains and how they work, how they've evolved over time. There are dozens and dozens of them, and I could spend all my time going over them, but I feel that these are the 4 most important ones that you could really spend time becoming familiar with and really observing these in your trading experiences and then using methods and techniques to help reduce these, transform these, or assuage these so they don't affect your trading performance. These 4 will kill your trading performance in and of itself. And they're probably behind, I would say, 50 to 60+% of all of the mindset and psychological and emotional challenges you experience while you are trading. So with that being said, I want to get into these 4 psychological or cognitive biases that kill your trading performance. So the first one, so these are the 4 major cognitive biases. The first one is hindsight bias, and I'll be explaining the definition of each one shortly after. The next one is loss aversion. I'm sure many of you probably are already familiar with this, whether you knew about it or not. The third is recency bias. And the last is confirmation bias. So let's dive into each one of these and kind of unearth them, unpack them, and explain how these will come up and redirect your mental focus, your cognitive energies, and take them in the wrong direction so that you can see them for what they are, recognize them, and in the future apply a method and technique to relate to these, to transform these, and to deal with these or recorrect them. So the first one is hindsight bias. Now, hindsight bias is a basic experience of we are in a trade or we're looking to make a trade. Maybe we see something that's happening and we're like, I think the market is going to do this. But then you start to look at the charts and you're kind of like, well, I'm not totally sure. I think so, but there's this, and this. So you have an inkling, you have a feeling, but you look back upon it, or when you really look at it, you're not totally sure. And then what happens is the market plays itself out and it ends up doing exactly what you did, or what you originally thought it was, what that initial feeling was. And what happens is we tend to slip into hindsight bias. Hindsight bias has 3 major errors. It's basically going back in hindsight and saying, I always knew that was going to happen. When in reality, during that trade, you had a feeling, but when you looked at the available evidence, some of it was contradictory and you weren't sure. In fact, you kind of had your doubts as well. Yet, what we end up doing is kind of labeling that past experience as like, oh, I knew that. So the 3 levels of cognitive errors inside hindsight bias is: 1, we develop flawed memories. We develop a memory, I knew that. And in reality, when we looked at all the available evidence, it was not totally succinct and it was somewhat contradictory and we weren't sure. That's the real experience of it. But we ignore that part and we end up labeling this memory in a very flawed way as, oh, I knew that all along. The second, which is kind of a corollary point to it, is just belief in the outcome in the way it happened. Oh, I knew it was going to do that. When in reality, you just felt like, hey, I think the market's going to break out. You had no idea how the market was going to break out and not pull back to the level and yet kind of chop around for a little bit, but then finally go to its target. You didn't fully know that. And at the time you thought, okay, I think there's a breakout, but I don't know how far it's going to go. So it creates this belief that things ended up manifesting exactly the way that you had suspected they would, when they really didn't. And the last part is that the whole thing was predictable, which in reality, it wasn't. So there are many different levels of cognitive errors that are happening when we are engaged or enacting out a hindsight bias. And basically the essence of the hindsight bias is to look at info in the past and we say, okay, now I know all the facts. I know I have all the facts in place here. And we look at it and say, I knew this was true. And then we create a story or a false memory or this kind of idea around this experience to kind of make sense of the event, when in reality we were very unsure. We were 50-50, maybe 60-40 at best. And this is a major thing because it causes 2 problems for us as traders. The first one is it causes feelings of regret. I knew that was going to happen. I don't know why I didn't hold it. I felt like it was going to go to this target and I shouldn't have closed it out early for profit. Damn it. It creates this feelings of regret. So we negatively, we only see the negative portion of what we didn't capture or what we didn't do. And we seem to negate or ignore the things that we did right. Hey, I pulled the trigger when I wasn't exactly feeling totally sure, but I followed my system. At least in the entry part and getting involved in it. So it creates this feelings of regret. And that doesn't inspire us to enact or do the correct behavior the next time. If we constantly experience feelings of regret, well, just imagine what that would be like to be carrying all that around while you're trying to make trading decisions. That you're regretting this, that you're regretting that, you're regretting this, you're regretting that. What kind of self-image does that create? The second thing is that it prevents us from learning. Why is that? If you have the belief, oh, I knew it was going to do that all along, then you'll label this in your mindset as something, hey, I knew this. And so you don't spend any time investigating everything that happened around the situation. Hey, why didn't I, pull the trade? Why didn't I hold the trade for my full profit target? Why didn't I let this trade run? Why didn't I get involved in the trade? If you knew all along that something was going to happen, you ended up not doing it, you won't look into the reasons why. So it reduces or prevents us from investigating and really learning and unearthing all the things that were behind our original decision, because we've labeled it, well, I knew this was going to happen and this has played out the way it is, so what's there to look into? And that's a problem. That is a problem, that anytime we are prevented from learning or we prevent ourselves from learning, anytime we don't investigate and really unearth the things that are going on, the psychological, mental, and cognitive errors that we are enacting out, they are going to repeat themselves. So this is a major bias that we all experience, or we all kind of It comes with part of our default programming, and it's something that you're going to have to become aware of and redirect when it's happening in real time. The next one is loss aversion. And this is a very, very strong bias we have. So luckily there's been a lot of studies on this. And basically, neurologically, the experiences we have from a loss and a win, even if they're the exact same amount in money, will have neurologically a 2.5 times greater impact. What does that mean? That they will trigger stronger neurological reactions and engage more neurological circuits and neural networks than win will. So if we have 2 trades, or if we have 10 trades, and 5 of them are winners for $500 and 5 of them are losses for $500, the losses, even though they're exact same amount, even if you know that the losses are going to be exact same amount as the wins ahead of time, you're still going to have a 250% stronger neurological reaction to those losses than you will win. A loss aversion bias is pretty straightforward. We have an aversion to losing money, losing the game, losing relationships, losing people, losing things that we own. We have a lot of loss aversion. We surround ourselves with it, basically, through our own cognitive biases. And this is important to understand. It's also important to understand several little losses in a row, if they are cumulative, like a losing streak, can have the equivalent of one giant loss. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's on the same level financially. What does it mean? So let's say I have several losses that total up to $5,000. They will, if they just keep happening one after another, even though it may only at the end of it equal $5,000, because they've happened so many times in a row or close to each other, psychologically the toll keeps adding up, and it can eventually equal the same neurological or psychological experience for us as if we just lost $15,000. It feels heavier. That's why losing streaks, the longer they go on, the heavier they feel, the more emotional we get, the less able we are to get ourselves back on track and execute mentally correctly. As soon as you get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the further you progress along that track, the exponentially larger aversive experience we are having. And that just throws us off course, even though it could be financially a lot less than an actual big loss. This is part of the underlying reason why more so beginners, but people as a whole, look for high win ratio systems. There is no proof, there is absolutely no proof today that higher win ratio systems make more money than lower win ratio systems, because most high win ratio systems win a lot less per trade. And they also become more unstable when they go through drawdowns. But we still look for these systems. It's our natural, or I wouldn't say natural, I would say it's a predetermined, it's a kind of already built into our software that comes with our neural operating system, that we will look for things to be more accurate, high win ratio systems. So this way we can avoid experiencing that loss, that psychological and neurological reaction to a loss. We will avoid lower win ratio systems and somehow unconsciously seek out higher win ratio systems. So this is a bias we have. There was some people have done some really good studies on this. Ironically, out of the University of Finland. I would never expect Finland to be doing a lot of studies on trading, but they have. So there's somebody out there in Kostia, and they were able to measure this, and they had people go through simulations and trades and all kinds of stuff. And what they realize is that we are 50% more likely to realize gains versus losses. Or translation, we're 50% more likely to close a winner early before its final target versus actually taking the full loss. Because if we take the full loss, if at any point in time during the loss, we're partially negative, we're halfway negative, whatever, there's still this belief and hope that we might be right. And there's also an aversion to actually closing the trade, because once they close it, it's official. It's a loss, even if it's just for a little bit. But if we get into a trade and the trade goes right into profit right off the bat, and then it starts to pull back a little bit and the pullback looks a little suspicious and sneaky, we're much more likely to close that trade. So this way we can make sure it closes officially as a winner, and therefore we can know with certainty we avoid that loss. How many of you have experienced this? How many of you just have this greater tension around a winner that is now starting to pull back, leading us to a point where there's just so much psychological tension and worry and concern and all this and that, we close the trade early? I'm willing to bet a lot of you experience it. I experience it as well. A lot less now, but I still do. This experience of loss aversion is found across all types of traders. It doesn't matter whether you are a day trader, swing trader, a position trader. All types of traders experience this. What we have noticed is that, and this was done by Kaustia in their studies, is that there's something called a disposition of risk amongst day traders. So what does that mean? So let's say a day trader has a max risk of 6% a day. Let's just take any number. And let's say they, within the first half of the day, are already down. Let's say they've lost 6 trades in a row. They risk 0.5% per trade. In the second half of the day, they are much more likely to increase their risk per trade and abandon their 0.5% per trade. They're more likely to increase risk so that they can make up for those losses and that they don't end the day in the negative. Even though mathematically they know ahead of time they should only be risking 0.5% per trade, and that there's variance and that they could go on losing streaks, they're willing to increase the risk so that they avoid the day being a loss. That's how strong this is. It throws them off course. It is so strong it can get them to do something that they consciously and conceptually and intellectually know they should not be doing. The good thing is that experience over time reduces this effect. You'll see it in poker and you'll see it in trading. And in poker, I am taking way less risk, I'm getting involved in way less hands through the flop, turn, and river than I was before. So pre-flop is the 2 cards that everybody gets in Texas Hold'em. Once the betting's all agreed upon, then they throw out 3 cards. That's called the flop. Every street, which is called flop, turn, and river, each one of those is a street. Every street that comes along in poker increases the probabilities that the pot will get bigger and bigger. And so if you win more. But if you lose a lot more. And it becomes expensive. And so what ends up happening is over time, poker players end up getting involved in less pots. Because they know the further they go along it, the more expensive it is. And unless they really have a good hand that can win the pot, or they can outplay their opponent, they're less likely to get involved. Experience reduces this effect. The same thing with trading. Trading will eventually reduce our propensity to close winners early. It will reduce our propensity to avoid trades entirely. It will reduce our propensity to get so stunned by an individual loss or even a few losses in a row. Experience reduces this over time. There are a couple things you can do to help reduce this. One of them is this think like a trader approach. So in this study by Costia, he worked with certain groups of people, and one of the groups he worked with, the experimental group, was he would tell them, okay, you're going to think like a trader would think. Even though these people weren't traders, they were just people going through experience. And then he would describe to them how a trader holds their positions longer, how they manage risk properly. He would describe how traders are okay handling losses and things like that. And then what he noticed is this experimental group that he told to think like a trader and told them what they should be doing, they experience a much lesser, smaller neurological reaction to these losses, to the experiences, than the control groups. People who weren't told anything. And so this is, hinting at, and there's many methods you could use to do this, which we teach in the ATM course. But this is a critical method or a concept that demonstrates, look, by adopting a particular mindset, we can actually change the way we think, trade, and perform. The last part is the portfolio approach, and this is another method you could use. So most traders, professional, institutional, pension, mutual fund, all these traders, they don't tend to look at these as individual trades per se. They look at things as more of a portfolio. And what this portfolio approach is, and this is something that Costia also experimented with, is that if you look at each individual trade and win-loss, as being very meaningful, that's going to have a much stronger neurological reaction than if you look at all of the trades you're going to do for a year and say, look, I'm going to make all kinds of decisions. I'm going to go long the Japanese yen. I'm going to buy gold. I'm going to go short equities. I'm going to do all these things. You know that some of those are going to turn out to be losses. But if you think of things as an overall portfolio that, hey, some of these are going to win, some of these are not, but the sum total of all my trades will be one portfolio that in the end ends up making money. If you take this overall approach, then what it does is it creates this buffer from the loss aversion for each individual trade. It kind of creates this gap in zone so that instead of every trade meaning like everything about you, it's like the end of the world if you lose that one trade and it means so much. Instead of each trade having such a strong psychological and neurological impact, what we end up doing is we end up saying, look, this is part of a broader picture, perspective, portfolio of what I'm taking in the markets. I'm sure I'm going to lose some here and there, but I believe that when all is said and done at the end of this portfolio that I've taken throughout this year, I'm going to make money. And so this is something that you can do. It's kind of a mindset tactic you can do to help reduce the loss aversion bias you will experience on an individual trade basis. And the last one is the recency bias. Recency bias is a very important one for us to understand because we are much more likely to act, think, and believe that the things that we're experiencing now, the things that are happening in the now, are much more tied to and relevant and causal results of the recent events versus events long ago. It's agnostically charged. So what does this mean? It means that if something is happening now to us that is good, or something that is happening to us now that we consider bad, we're much more likely to affirm or believe that this is happening because of something we just recently did, when it could in fact be the result of something that actually happened a long time ago. There's a really good example of this. I was just reading this in Politics Today, of how politicians tend to avoid this. So there's a situation where, and I'm not taking a political side here, I'm just saying I noticed this. There's a chance where the current president, Obama, has a chance to affirm a new Supreme Court justice. And because the justices are evenly split 4-4 right now amongst conservative and liberals, if he appoints somebody who is quote unquote liberal, then it tilts the balance of the court in one direction a little bit. And Republicans are all up in arms about it. And, they're having a fit. They're saying, we're not going to accept any nomination. And Obama's saying, hey, it's my constitutional duty and right as president to nominate a justice. And what's actually happening is there's recency bias. There's this real strange situation of events that have happened 8 years ago are actually now coming into play now. But everybody's not pointing to that. They're all pointing to, hey, this is how you guys have been in the last year or two or something like that. And so it's really interesting because Obama was in this situation, except he was on the other side of the aisle and he was saying, we're going to block your nomination. He was going to block the Republicans' nomination. And that was 2008 as a senator. And then now all of a sudden he's in the opposite side. He's in the other chair. And he's sitting there going, man, I really regret making that decision back in the day. He sure as hell didn't regret it back then. And he's not even realizing, hey, what's actually happening now is tied to 8 years ago. But, and then the Republicans are doing the same thing. They're doing the exact same thing. They're sitting there going, well, it's completely uncharacteristic of, a lame duck president to nominate a Supreme Court justice, which is actually complete bullshit because historically, anytime this has happened, the president will nominate somebody. And they're just using kind of their recency bias of looking at the most recent events and how, Obama's trained. It's just kind of this hilarious spectacle of bullshit. And so it doesn't matter, the recency bias is just very straightforward. If I have had several losses in a row, I'm much more likely in my next trade to believe that this trade is more likely going to be a loss than it is a win. I am much stronger, or much more likely psychologically, emotionally, neurologically going to tilt that the next trade is going to be a loss versus a randomly distributed trade, meaning it could win or lose and I have no idea. But somehow we think we know more. And it's also the same for wins. If we go on a winning streak, we are much more likely to be overconfident instead of realizing, hey, I'm on a winning streak right now and this is going to rebalance itself out. So it doesn't matter whether it's a positive or a negative. We experience recency bias. And we are just much more prone to see things that are happening, not necessarily the whole sum of things. Hey, that winning streak is actually a result of all the hard work I've done over the time. No, it's because I made this one change here. We ignore all the other work that we did. So we're much more likely to ignore all the causes that have led us up to this moment versus just look at the most recent things. That's recency bias. The difference is, and there is kind of a tilt here, a skew, our brains are going to have stronger neurological reactions to this recency bias when the most recent events are negative. So we are going to have a much stronger neurological and biological response if we are on a losing streak versus a winning streak. We are much more likely to take a new event that could be a random event. For example, you got a parking ticket. In the same day, somebody happened to hit your car and they just drove off without even telling you, like, while your car was parked. And, the tax people sent you a notice saying they're going to audit you. You're much more, the first event, you're kind of like, okay, I got a parking ticket. I get it. The second one, somebody hits your car and you start thinking, man, is there something what's happening with my car? Why are all these crazy things happening to my car? So then you start to kind of have this kind of negative tilt, like, man, this is just a bad day. We will even label it a bad day. And then we get that letter from the IRS saying you're going to be audited. And then you're thinking, what the F is going on today? What's wrong? And we're just going to look at things in our recent history to see if we can find an answer. And we'll pay attention to that. But we'll ignore the fact that maybe you didn't file your taxes for a year. Or maybe you forgot. Maybe you really filled out a form pretty poorly. That sent a red flag to the IRS. There's all kinds of things that can really be causes of it. But the recency bias will redirect our attention so that we don't see those things, or we kind of gloss over them or ignore them, and really just focus on, okay, what happened today, yesterday, what's in my recent kind of experience that would prime us into, okay, I can understand why this happened. So the recency bias is another one that we tend to experience, and it's something we have to avoid. We have to learn how to take each win and loss as part of a large series of events, not necessarily something wrong with us. Last one is confirmation bias. And this one's pretty straightforward. We're much more likely to give greater weight to variables which support our claims versus negate them. So let's say we have a trade idea. We're going to be bullish on a particular pair instrument. And we feel like, okay, well, there's a breakout. And so I believe this breakout's going to manifest and it's going to go to the upside. And it should go to this level, this level, and this level. Breakout happens, but it really just kind of stalls. And, we're kind of like, okay, well, I thought it was going to be a pure momentum break. I thought the momentum was on my side, but it's not going anywhere. And then it just doesn't go anywhere. And then it just doesn't go anywhere. And instead of realizing that maybe this, there's something I missed, maybe there, I'm actually buying a breakout right in front of a resistance zone. Maybe this momentum that I saw was there is actually not real. Instead of seeing all that, we're going to look at all the things that will support our idea. Well, I still have this support in place, and there's this corrective structure here, and it hasn't broken this level, so it's still bullish. So I'm still bullish on it. Even though all these new things probably would force you to get stopped out, you're kind of like, well, I still think it's bullish, so I'm going to move my stop and hold on to the trade. What we're experiencing is loss aversion bias and confirmation bias. We're going to look at things which support our claims versus actually the ones which challenge our way of thinking. And that's the difference. A professional trader doesn't just look at the things that say, yeah, this is probably a good idea. They're going to look at things that say, that's not a good idea for this reason, this reason, this reason. And then they're going to weigh them, and then that weight and that overall kind of synthesis of that information is what will guide their decision. Not just, hey, this looks great, this looks great, this looks great. Okay, great. This is why you'll often see people who are highly critical of other people. They will only look at the information that supports their view of that person, and they will negate any piece of information which will disagree with them. That's why people who are overly argumentative will just keep looking at every piece of information that supports their claim, and they really won't even consider anything that disagrees with them or disproves their idea to some degree or invalidates it. So that is confirmation bias. It's not just retroactive looking, meaning we don't look at the past variables. It means we will also look for future data that comes out to also support our claim. Hey, I believe such and such person is the shittiest person on the planet, and something new comes, and I will actively filter a lot of the data that comes through in the future to lean towards, hey, it's also supporting my claim. Yeah, and he's going to do this, and it's going to result in this. And he's going to do this, and it's going to result in this. And, instead of being like, okay, I think things will go this way, but I'm open to being wrong. There's a very difference. It's a big difference. So it's not just retroactive. It doesn't just look in the past. It looks in the future as well. That we will expect things in the future, and we will look for things in the future with a kind of rose-colored lens that will skew things towards confirming our current bias about this person or this situation or whatever. So with that being said, all of these have a root. And they're rooted in the negativity bias. And that's why we kind of started off the mindset section with the negativity bias. Because it's like the root bias behind all these other psychological things that we experience. It's underlying pretty much all of them. I really haven't found a situation where it's not involved in one way or another. It's like the soil which all these other biases sprout from. It's most present in loss aversion. In fact, many of the other biases we experience are consequences or offshoots of loss aversion. It's part of the reason why it's so hard for us as individuals to admit we're wrong about a trade, about an argument, about this thing, about that thing. It pushes us. The reason why it's hard for us to admit we're wrong is because us being wrong can trigger a negative reaction in us. Something is wrong with us. It can feel threatening. Most people have a hard time admitting they're wrong. When you really examine them, they feel threatened. They feel there's something that's like threatening them, that if they're wrong, it like means something about them, physically, psychologically, whatever. And so this negative bias is part of the reason why we push for certainty, why we try and avoid being wrong, or we avoid stimuli which threaten us, challenge us, and negate our views. Because the more certainty we can find in our life, the less of this supposed negative bias we experience, the less times we're wrong. It's much easier to pick yes men as our staff or our coaches or whatever, people who constantly say yes, 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 you're the best, you do this right. It's much easier to do that than to find people who are actually going to say, no, you're off your effing rocker. You're totally wrong on this one here. I'm your friend, I'm your mentor, whatever, but you're completely way off base on this one, in my opinion. I think you're not seeing this. We avoid these situations a lot. We tend to avoid situations where somebody's going to disagree with us. And that's because that negativity bias and that feeling of threat and us being wrong. It blinds us to seeing things as they are, seeing things for what they are. It blinds us from seeing things in a non-personal way. That's why trading in some ways seems so personal. A loss seems so personal. What's wrong with me? I hear people saying all the time. Why does a single loss have anything to do with you? Why does a single loss have anything to do with something you did wrong? Maybe you did everything perfectly. Why is a loss so personal? Because of this negativity bias, this threat. It almost feels like something to our survival is at stake. Maybe not our physical, maybe our financial, maybe our psychological survival. We feel that there's so much at stake, and that's because of this negativity bias. And that's why it's the negativity bias is the first thing we talk about, because it's one of the most important things we can unroot and transform and rewire. So with that being said, we will actually, in the next lesson, talk about a practice that can help undo this negativity bias, that can rewire our brains so we're not skewed or oriented in one way or another. That we can make sure that we are aware of it when it's happening, any one of these biases when these are happening. Because this is one of the major challenges for you psychologically, emotionally, and neurologically while trading, is overcoming these biases, transforming them, particularly the negativity bias. So with that being said, I hope you found this useful. I hope you found ways to, I hope this kind of brought up things for you about things that you commonly, traps and biases that you commonly fall into and pitfalls. And so I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of impact upon this has upon you, what kind of aha moments you got from this. And so with that being said, yeah, I'll see you guys inside the course.